Alright, folks, settle in. It's Halloween night 1989. The air is cold, the leaves crunch underfoot, and in the quiet suburb of Ashford Heights, one house stands out from the rest. The lights, the fog, the screams, all crafted by a beloved science teacher named Martin Dreyfus. Parents called him the spirit of Halloween, but behind the masks and laughter, he was building something darker. A secret that would turn the holiday into a nightmare. This is The Halloween Collector, the story of a man who turned his obsession with costumes into a collection of horror. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Halloween has always been about masks and costumes, about becoming someone or something else for just one night. But in the fall of 1989, in the quiet suburb of Ashford Heights, Connecticut, one man took that concept to a place so dark and twisted that it would forever change how that community celebrated the holiday. His name was Martin Dreyfus, and while the world knew him as a friendly middle school science teacher who loved Halloween more than anyone else in town, behind the elaborate decorations and generous candy bowls was a collector of the most horrifying kind. This is the story of the man the FBI would later call the Halloween Collector, and the night his carefully constructed world finally came crashing down. Martin Dreyfus was 43 years old in 1989, a lifelong bachelor who had taught 8th grade science at Ashford Middle School for nearly 15 years. His students loved him. He was the teacher who made learning fun, who brought in real animal skulls and let the kids touch them, who could make even the most boring lesson about photosynthesis seem fascinating. But it was his love of Halloween that made him truly legendary in Ashford Heights. Every year without fail, Martin would transform his modest 2-story colonial home into the neighborhood's premier Halloween destination. We're talking about a month-long project that began the first week of October. He would erect an elaborate graveyard in his front yard, complete with fog machines and motion-activated tombstones. He built a tunnel of terror through his garage, where brave trick-or-treaters could walk through curtains of fake spiderwebs, while animatronic zombies lurched at them from the shadows. And his decorations weren't cheap store-bought plastic. Martin was an artist. He hand-sculpted his own props, creating incredibly lifelike corpses and monsters that were so realistic that parents would sometimes complain they were too scary for young children. But Martin would just laugh in that good-natured way of his and say that Halloween was supposed to be scary. On Halloween night, he would dress in an elaborate costume, something different every year. One year, he was a plague doctor with an authentic-looking leather mask. Another year, he was a convincing werewolf with professional-grade prosthetics. He would stand on his porch from 5 in the evening until well past 10 at night, personally greeting every single trick-or-treater, acting out his character, and handing out full-sized candy bars. The kids would line up down the block just to visit Mr. Dreyfus's house. Parents considered it a rite of passage. But what none of them knew, what no one could have possibly known, was that Martin's obsession with Halloween, with masks and costumes and transformation, had a much darker purpose. He wasn't just celebrating the holiday. He was hunting. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came on the morning of November 1st, 1989. A 13-year-old girl named Rebecca Hartley had gone trick-or-treating the night before with a group of her friends. They had visited dozens of houses, including Mr. Dreyfus's elaborate haunted setup. Rebecca had come home around 9:30 that night, showed her parents her haul of candy, and gone to bed. But when her mother went to wake her for school the next morning, Rebecca's bed was empty. The window to her second-floor bedroom was open, and the screen had been carefully removed from the outside and placed on the floor. Rebecca was gone. The Ashford Heights police launched an immediate investigation. They quickly discovered something that made their blood run cold. Rebecca wasn't the first. When they started digging through old missing persons reports from surrounding towns, they found a pattern. Over the past 7 years, 6 children had vanished on Halloween night or in the early morning hours of November 1st. All of them were between the ages of 12 and 14. All of them had been trick or treating in their respective neighborhoods. And in every single case, they had disappeared from their bedrooms through a second-story window that had been opened from the outside. The realization was horrifying. Someone had been using Halloween as cover, watching children as they trick-or-treated, following them home, and then returning in the dead of night to take them. A serial kidnapper had been operating across Connecticut for 7 years, and no one had connected the dots until now. The FBI was called in immediately. Special Agent Sarah Chen led the task force. She was a specialist in child abduction cases, and she knew they were in a race against time. Statistically, if Rebecca was still alive, they had maybe 72 hours to find her before her chances of survival dropped to almost zero. The investigation was massive and frantic. Every registered sex offender in a 50-mile radius was brought in for questioning. They set up roadblocks and searched vehicles. They brought in bloodhounds and searched the woods surrounding Ashford Heights. But they found nothing. Rebecca had simply vanished. It was Rebecca's best friend, a girl named Jennifer, who provided the first real lead. She told investigators that when their group had visited Mr. Dreyfus's house, he had been dressed as the Grim Reaper, complete with a black hooded robe and a realistic skull mask. He had been handing out candy and acting scary as usual. But Jennifer mentioned something odd. She said that Mr. Dreyfus had seemed particularly interested in Rebecca. He had complimented her costume, which was a simple vampire outfit, and had asked her several questions about where she lived and whether she lived on a first or second floor. At the time, Jennifer thought he was just being nice and making conversation. But now, in the context of Rebecca's disappearance, it felt sinister. Agent Chen decided to pay Martin Dreyfus a visit. It was just a routine interview, she told herself. After all, he was a respected teacher with no criminal record. He had lived in Ashford Heights for over 20 years. There was no reason to suspect him. But Chen was a careful investigator, and she knew that sometimes the monster is hiding in plain sight. When she and 2 local detectives arrived at Martin's house on the afternoon of November 2nd, they found him in his front yard taking down his Halloween decorations. He was friendly, cooperative, and seemed genuinely shocked and saddened to hear about Rebecca's disappearance. He invited them inside for coffee. The inside of Martin's home was neat and tastefully decorated. There were bookshelves filled with science textbooks and classic literature. His walls were covered with framed photos of his students over the years, all smiling at science fairs and field trips. He seemed like a devoted teacher. When asked about Halloween night, Martin had a detailed recollection. He remembered Rebecca's group visiting. He confirmed that he had chatted with her briefly about her costume. But he insisted he had spoken to probably 200 kids that night, and Rebecca hadn't stood out in any particular way. He provided his whereabouts for the entire night. He had been on his porch until 10:15, then had spent about an hour cleaning up, and had gone to bed around midnight. He lived alone, so he had no alibi for the overnight hours, but neither did most single people. Agent Chen thanked him for his time, and the investigators left. But something was bothering her. It was nothing concrete, just a feeling. As they walked back to their car, she looked back at Martin's house and noticed something. The basement had small windows at ground level, but they had been painted black from the inside. It was unusual, but not unheard of. Lots of people finished their basements as media rooms and painted the windows for darkness. Still, the image stuck in her mind. That evening, Chen decided to dig deeper into Martin Dreyfus's background. What she found was a life that was almost too normal, too carefully constructed. He had no family. Both his parents were dead, and he had been an only child. He had never been married, never even seemed to have dated. His entire life revolved around his job and Halloween. She pulled his employment records and found that he had taken personal days from school during the first week of November for the past 7 years. And when she cross-referenced those dates with the missing children, she felt her heart start to race. Every single time a child had vanished on Halloween, Martin Dreyfus had taken the next 3 to 5 days off from work. Chen knew she didn't have enough for a warrant. Circumstantial evidence and a bad feeling wouldn't convince a judge. But she couldn't shake the certainty that was growing in her gut. She decided to put Martin under 24-hour surveillance. If he was their guy, and if Rebecca was still alive, he might lead them to her. For the next 18 hours, nothing happened. Martin went to school, taught his classes, came home, graded papers. He seemed completely normal. But then, at 2:30 in the morning on November 3rd, the surveillance team watching Martin's house radioed in. Martin had just left his house carrying a large black duffel bag. He got into his car and started driving. Chen and her team followed at a distance. Martin drove for nearly 40 minutes, heading away from the suburbs and into a rural area of thick woods and abandoned farms. He finally pulled off onto an old logging road and drove about a mile into the forest. The FBI team, now including a full tactical unit, followed on foot. What they found, hidden deep in the woods, was a small, dilapidated hunting cabin that had been abandoned for years. Martin had parked his car and was walking toward the cabin with his duffel bag. Chen gave the order, and the tactical team moved in. They breached the cabin door just as Martin was descending a set of wooden stairs into a hidden basement. The scene that greeted the investigators in that basement was the stuff of nightmares. It was a small underground room, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with stone walls that had been reinforced with soundproofing material. And there, chained to a metal bed frame, weak and terrified but alive, was Rebecca Hartley. Martin had been in the process of preparing what he called his procedure. Laid out on a metal table next to Rebecca were surgical instruments, makeup supplies, and most horrifyingly, several handcrafted masks made of a flexible material that looked disturbingly lifelike. During his interrogation, Martin Dreyfus confessed to everything with an eerie calmness that chilled even the experienced FBI agents. He explained that he had been obsessed with transformation and identity since childhood. He had been a lonely, bullied kid who found escape in wearing masks and becoming someone else. But as he grew older, his obsession had twisted into something monstrous. He didn't want to just wear a mask himself. He wanted to create living dolls, children who he could transform into whatever character he wanted them to be. His plan, which he had been perfecting over 7 years, was to keep the children in his hidden cabin for approximately 1 week. During that time, he would create custom masks of their faces and force them to perform in elaborate scenarios he had written. He claimed he never physically harmed them and that after a week, he would release them miles away from where he had taken them. But as the investigation continued, the truth was far worse. The FBI found 6 graves in the woods surrounding the cabin. Martin had not released his victims. He had killed them after his week-long rituals, unable to let them go with the knowledge of what he had done. Rebecca Hartley had been hours away from becoming his 7th victim. Martin Dreyfus was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping. He is currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ashford Heights, like many towns touched by such horror, would never be quite the same. For years afterward, Halloween was a muted affair. Parents kept their children close, and many homes simply stopped participating in trick-or-treating altogether. But slowly, as the years passed and new families moved to the neighborhood, the joy of Halloween began to return. Yet every year, on October 31st, there is still one house on Maple Street that remains completely dark, its lawn empty of decorations, a reminder that monsters are real and that sometimes they are hiding behind the kindest smiles and the most generous candy bowls.
She checked her phone footage and saw herself awake. The small apartment in Austin, Texas, was a testament to Amelia's love for order. Every book on the shelf was alphabetized, the throw pillows on the couch were always perfectly fluffed, and the kitchen counters were perpetually clear. Her life was a carefully curated sequence of events, a calm and predictable rhythm. She was a freelance graphic designer, and her days were spent in the quiet company of her monitor, a cup of green tea, and her dog, a sleepy beagle named Barnaby. Her nights were a different story. For the past few weeks, sleep had become her enemy. She would wake up in the middle of the night, a profound and unsettling chill running through her, with no memory of what had disturbed her. The first few times, she dismissed it. A bad dream, a strange noise from a neighbor, the natural restlessness of a person under a bit of stress, but it started to happen every night. Always around 3:00 a.m. She would sit up in bed, wide awake, her heart pounding, her mind a blank slate. The strange awakenings started to take their toll. She was perpetually exhausted, her focus at work was suffering, and the lines of her carefully ordered life were beginning to blur. Her friends joked that she needed a sleep mask and some lavender oil. Her doctor suggested a change in diet and more exercise. Nothing worked. The sense of profound unease persisted. A cold, sharp dread that would hit her the moment her eyes opened in the pre-dawn darkness. One morning, she woke up with an idea. It was born of desperation and a need for proof. She would record herself sleeping. It was a simple solution. She would set up her phone on a small tripod at the foot of her bed, start the video recording, and in the morning, she would have her answers. Maybe she snored. Maybe she thrashed around in her sleep. Maybe a neighbor's loud music was the culprit. Anything was better than the quiet, terrifying unknown. The first night, she set up the phone, pressed record, and climbed into bed, feeling a strange mixture of relief and foolishness. She fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion finally winning the battle. She woke up at 3:07 a.m., just a few minutes later than her usual time. The same icy dread washed over her. She got up, stopped the recording, and went back to sleep. Her mind filled with a faint sense of disappointment that she had woken up again. The next morning, with a cup of coffee in hand, she sat down at her desk to watch the video. She fast-forwarded through the footage, watching her sleeping form, seeing the steady rise and fall of her chest, Barnaby curled up at her feet. She skipped ahead to the 3:00 a.m. mark. She watched herself stir in her sleep, her body tensing, and then her eyes snapped open, just as she remembered. She sat up in bed, her face a mask of fear. She watched herself look around the room, her head slowly turning from side to side. Then, she saw something else on the screen, something she hadn't seen in the moment. In the background of the shot, just by the open closet door, a shadow seemed to deepen. It was an unnatural movement, a thickening of the darkness. It was slow and deliberate, like someone stepping out from the shadows. She froze, a cold shiver racing down her spine. The figure was gaunt, tall, and dressed in a long dark coat. Its hands were impossibly long, the fingers like spidery branches. It took a step out of the closet and stood there, motionless, watching her sleeping form. The Amelia on the screen was looking at it now. She saw her head turn, her gaze fixed on the closet. But she didn't scream. She didn't move. She just sat there, a blank, terrified expression on her face, watching the thing in the darkness. The figure in the coat raised one of its long arms, and slowly, gently, it waved. A single, slow motion, like a farewell. Then it simply faded into the darkness, the space where it had been returning to normal. Just as the figure vanished, the Amelia on the screen shuddered, and her eyes, now filled with tears, looked down at her lap. A few seconds later, she reached for her phone, and the video ended. Amelia's mind was reeling. This was not a nightmare. This was real. She was not waking up on her own. Something was waking her up. Something that was waiting in her closet, watching her. She didn't know what it was. She didn't want to. She went back to the footage, pausing it, zooming in. The image was grainy, but the features were undeniable. The gaunt face, the impossibly long limbs, the dark coat. It was a thing of nightmares, come to life in her quiet, orderly apartment. She tried to rationalize it. A glitch in the camera? A trick of the light? But the movement was too fluid, too purposeful. It waved at her. She watched the motion again and again, her stomach churning with nausea and dread. She called a friend, but her words sounded crazy, even to her own ears. "I saw a monster on my phone," she said, her voice cracking. Her friend tried to be supportive, but she could hear the confusion and concern in her tone. She spent the next few days in a fog of fear. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't work. The fear was a constant, heavy presence. she went to the police. They listened patiently, their faces a mix of politeness and skepticism. They suggested she see a counselor. They told her there were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of anything amiss. She was on her own. She decided to try the video again. She knew it was a terrible idea, but the need for answers was a powerful and dangerous force. She was a woman who needed to understand, to organize, to label. The unknown was her greatest fear. She set up the phone again, her hands shaking, and got into bed, leaving a small lamp on this time. She couldn't bear to be in total darkness. She fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams a chaotic jumble of shadowy figures and long, spidery hands. She woke up, as always, at 3:00 a.m. Her eyes opened, and she felt the now familiar chill. She looked at the closet door. It was closed. She felt a brief moment of relief. Then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from inside her closet. A slow, gentle tapping, as if something were drumming its fingers on the back of the door. The sound was not loud, but it was so deliberate, so unnatural, that it was 1,000 times more terrifying than a scream. She watched the closet door, her eyes wide with fear. The tapping stopped. Then she heard a faint, scratching sound. It was coming from the floor, just beneath the door. She watched as a small, thin, black object slid out from under the door. It was a piece of paper, folded into a perfect square. It was pushed all the way out into the middle of the floor, and then the scratching sound stopped. She was too terrified to move, to breathe. She waited until the first light of dawn broke through her window. The terror had given way to a quiet, cold determination. She got out of bed, her body stiff with fear. She went to the paper and picked it up. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unfold it. Inside, there was a single sentence, written in a spidery, unsettling script. "I miss our conversations." Her mind went blank. Conversations? What conversations? She didn't remember any conversations with a shadowy figure. The thought was horrifying. She had been awake. The video had shown her. But she had no memory of it. The thing in her closet was waking her up and speaking to her, and then somehow making her forget. It was more than a presence. It was a parasitic memory, a dark companion that was slowly, patiently stealing her waking hours. She ran. She didn't pack anything. She grabbed Barnaby, her keys, and her wallet, and she ran out of the apartment. She didn't stop to call anyone. She drove to the nearest motel, checked in, and sat on the bed in the middle of a brightly lit room, her phone footage playing on a loop. She watched herself, her sleeping self, a quiet, unsuspecting prey, and she watched the shadowy figure, a patient predator, waiting for her to wake up. She never went back to the apartment. She abandoned her furniture, her belongings, her carefully curated life. She moved to a new city, a place with a different time zone, where 3:00 a.m. was not 3:00 a.m. anymore. She installed security cameras throughout her new apartment, and she never, ever slept with her closet door closed. She started therapy, a long, difficult process of trying to understand the gaps in her memory and the nature of the fear that had become a constant companion. She learned about dissociative amnesia, about the mind's way of protecting itself from trauma, but she knew this wasn't just a psychological break. It was something else. Months turned into a year. She was beginning to heal. She had a new job, new friends, a new rhythm. The terror had receded, replaced by a quiet, lingering vigilance. The memory of the figure in the coat was a dull ache in the back of her mind, a scar from a wound that would never fully close. She still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, a cold dread in her stomach, but she would check her phone, the time would be a random number, and the fear would subside. She told herself she was okay. She told herself she was safe. Then, one night, she was having a restless dream, a dream of a long, dark hallway and a gaunt figure waiting at the end. She woke up with a gasp, her heart pounding. The clock on her nightstand read 3:00 a.m. A profound, icy coldness filled her room, seeping into her skin. Barnaby, who was sleeping at the foot of her bed, suddenly sat up, his ears twitching, and he began to growl, a low, guttural sound. He was looking at the closet door. It was closed. A single, small piece of paper slid out from under the door, unfolding as it went. It was a perfect square. It came to rest in the middle of her floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at Barnaby, and he was still growling, his eyes fixed on the paper. She was terrified, but a new feeling, a feeling she hadn't known before, was rising within her. It was a cold, quiet anger. This thing had stolen her peace, her home, her memories. It had chased her across states. She wasn't going to run anymore. She got out of bed, her legs trembling, but her resolve firm. She walked over to the paper, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, she picked it up. She unfolded it and read the words, written in that same spidery, unsettling script. "You can't outrun me." She looked at the closet door. "I know," she whispered into the darkness, her voice filled with a strange new power. She crumpled the paper in her hand and threw it in the trash. She went back to her bed and lay down, her heart still pounding, but the fear was different now. It was no longer a terror that paralyzed her. It was a challenge. She had been a victim for too long. She had been running. But what would happen if she stood still? She didn't know. But she was finally willing to find out. She would stay in this apartment, she would find out what this thing was, what it wanted, and she would fight it. She wasn't going to let it steal another minute of her life. She looked at her phone, at her reflection in the dark screen. The woman staring back at her was still afraid. But she was no longer just a victim. She was a warrior. And for the first time in a very long time, she was finally home. She wasn't going to let the shadows win. The stranger who sat at the edge of her bed and vanished. The old farmhouse, set deep in the rolling hills of rural Ohio, was everything Eleanor had ever wanted. A wraparound porch for drinking coffee at sunrise, a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth on cold nights, and a sky so dark with no city lights that the stars looked like a spilled handful of diamonds. She had moved there to escape the relentless noise of her life, to find a stillness she hadn't known since childhood. For a year, the house was her sanctuary. Its creaks and groans were the comfortable sounds of a living, breathing structure. The silence was a blanket she could wrap herself in. Then, the quiet changed. It was subtle at first. A feeling of being watched when she was alone in the kitchen. A cold draft in the hallway, even with every window sealed tight. She brushed it off as an overactive imagination, a side effect of living so far from civilization. She told herself it was just the isolation settling in. But then, one night, she woke up with a start. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. Sitting at the very edge of her bed, his back to her, was a figure. A man. His posture was slumped, his shoulders bowed, as if the weight of the world was resting on them. He was dressed in what looked like an old, dark suit, frayed at the cuffs, and he was completely still. Eleanor was frozen, a statue of pure terror. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. Her mind raced, grappling with the impossible reality. How did he get in? The doors were locked. The windows were secured. She didn't own a dog, so there was no alarm to be triggered. He was just there. She squeezed her eyes shut and then opened them again. He was still there. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum where sound should be. She could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a hummingbird trapped in her chest. She watched the figure, her eyes trying to make out his features, but he was just a silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds. She could feel his presence, a cold, heavy weight in the air. He wasn't breathing, not in a way a living person would. There was no rise and fall of his shoulders, just a desolate, unmoving stillness. After what felt like an eternity, he began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted one hand and rested it on the bed, just beside his leg. The fabric of the comforter didn't shift, but she felt a sudden, profound coldness radiating from the spot. It was like touching frozen steel. Then, just as slowly, he began to turn his head. Eleanor's breath hitched. She could see the profile of his face now. It was thin, gaunt, with an unnerving hollow where his eyes should have been. The other side of his face was lost in shadow. He was turning, slowly, agonizingly, to look at her. She felt an overwhelming dread, a primal fear that had nothing to do with a home invader and everything to do with something ancient and wrong. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was not a person. He was facing her now. She could not see his eyes in the gloom, but she felt them. 2 pinpricks of icy malice piercing through the darkness. A shiver of pure dread ran from the top of her head down to her toes. Then she saw his mouth, a long, thin line that curled up into a slow, deliberate, grotesque smile. The smile was not one of mirth or greeting. It was the smile of a predator, of a thing that had found its prey. And just as she felt the scream tear its way up her throat, the figure vanished. Not faded, not dissolved into mist, he simply ceased to be. One moment he was there, a solid form on the edge of her bed, and the next the space was empty. The cold spot on the comforter was gone. The heavy, oppressive feeling in the room lifted, replaced by the familiar, comforting quiet of her farmhouse. But the quiet was no longer a blanket. It was a shroud. She didn't sleep again that night, or the night after. The image of that gaunt face, that predatory smile, was seared into her mind. She tried to tell herself it was a waking dream, a hallucination brought on by stress, but the memory was too vivid, too real. She bought a new alarm system, installed motion-activated lights, and even got a large dog from the local shelter. She did everything she could to feel safe, but the feeling never returned. The man came back. Not every night, but randomly, sporadically. Sometimes a week would pass, and she would begin to think it was over. Then she'd wake up, a sudden, cold dread in her stomach, and see him again. Always at the same time, 3:17 a.m., always sitting at the edge of her bed, his back to her. He never spoke, never moved, except for that slow, terrifying turn. She stopped trying to scream. She just watched, paralyzed by fear, as he turned his head and gave her that awful, empty smile. She became a prisoner in her own home. She would stay up until 4:00 a.m. every night, drinking endless cups of coffee, trying to outlast the visitation. She would fall asleep in the armchair in the living room, with the lights on and the TV playing, but she would always wake up in her bed with a cold chill and the gnawing certainty that he had been there, that he had watched her, and then, at 3:17 a.m., had appeared to sit with her. She began to notice other things. Objects moved in her house, the books on her shelf would be out of order, a favorite teacup would be in the wrong cupboard. Her dog, a large and boisterous golden retriever, would often whimper and refuse to enter her bedroom after midnight. He would stand at the doorway, hackles raised, and growl at something Eleanor couldn't see. He saw him. She knew it. He saw the stranger. Desperate, she started researching the history of the house. She went to the local historical society, poring over brittle, yellowed documents. She found a story about the family who had built the house in the 1880s. The family, the Andersons, had a young son named Elias, who was an artist. He was known for his beautiful, unsettling portraits, particularly of a gaunt, shadowy figure he called the Watcher. He claimed the figure sat with him every night, watching him paint. The story ended abruptly. Elias was found dead in his bed, an expression of profound terror frozen on his face. The official cause of death was an unknown fever, but the town whispers suggested something else. Eleanor felt a cold dread, so complete it was a physical weight. The date of Elias's death? October 17th, 3:17. The time of her own terrifying visitations. Elias had seen the stranger too. He had painted him, given him a name, and then he had died. Was that what the stranger wanted? To be acknowledged? To be seen? The thought was terrifying. It wasn't a haunting, it was a possession. A slow, patient claiming of a soul. She couldn't stay in the house. Not anymore. She put it up for sale, listed it with a local agent who didn't ask too many questions. She packed her things with a desperate, feverish speed. As she placed the last box in the back of her car, she felt a profound wave of sadness. She loved this house. It had been her sanctuary, and now it was a cage. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was abandoning Elias, leaving him with his tormentor. She decided to do one last thing before she left. She went back inside, into her bedroom. She looked at the empty space at the edge of her bed, where the stranger sat. "I'm not like Elias," she whispered into the empty room, her voice trembling. "I'm not an artist. I can't paint you. I can't keep you here." She went to her desk and found a piece of paper and a pen. She didn't know why, she just felt compelled to. She wrote the numbers 3, 17 in large, clear script. And below it, she wrote, "I see you." She left the paper on the bedside table and walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. She didn't look back. She got in her car and drove away, the headlights illuminating the winding country road as she left the dark, silent house behind. She moved to a small apartment in a bustling town, a place full of noise and people and light. She felt a profound sense of relief. For a while, she slept soundly, the sounds of traffic and neighbors a comforting lullaby, but every night, at 3:17 a.m., she would wake up, not to a presence, not to a cold spot, but to a feeling of profound loss and loneliness. She would sit up, her heart aching with an emptiness she couldn't explain. One night, she dreamt of the farmhouse. She was in her bedroom, and she saw the stranger sitting on her bed, his back to her. But this time, he wasn't alone. Another figure was sitting beside him, a young boy, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. He was sketching in a notebook, a gentle smile on his face. He looked at her and then back at his drawing. The stranger turned his head and looked at her. He didn't smile, his grotesque smile. He just stared at her with that hollow place where his eyes should have been. And then, slowly, he nodded. A single, clear gesture. He had found someone else, a companion, and he had let her go. She never saw the stranger again. The cold feeling at 3:17 a.m. faded over time, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. She often wondered what had happened to Elias, and why the stranger had chosen him, and then her. She realized, in the end, that it hadn't been an act of malice. It had been a slow, lonely companionship. The stranger had been looking for a friend, a kindred spirit, a fellow watcher of the night. And now, he had found one. She lived the rest of her life in the city, far from the quiet of the Ohio hills. But sometimes, when she was alone and the world was asleep, she would think about the farmhouse and the two figures who sat there in the dark, watching. She would think of the stranger who had come to her in the night, and of the peace she had given him with her simple words, and she would feel a sense of quiet gratitude. She was no longer a stranger to the dark. She was a survivor of it.
Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because time matters on this road. If you like your stories strange, dark, and mysterious, you're in the right place. Tonight we're headed to a flat slice of America where the sky feels too big and the land doesn't give you much to hold on to western Ohio into eastern Indiana. Cornfields, drainage ditches, a turnpike that runs so straight it feels like a decision you made hours ago and can't take back. Out here there's an exit people talk about in the way you talk about a bad dream, trying to be casual, failing. By daylight it isn't there. No ramp, no sign, no merge lane. But after midnight, when the temperature drops and the road hum settles into your bones, a green rectangle appears in your high beams. Exit 41B, white letters. Arrow right. The locals call it Lost Prairie. The map doesn't. Our story follows a woman named Jordan Pike, 30, night shift nurse. Strong stomach, steady hands, the kind of person who can talk a stranger through a panic attack with just a voice and a cup of water. She was coming home from a double at the county hospital, eyes sandy, scrubs smelling like disinfectant and old coffee. It was 2:06 a.m., an hour she knew well. The turnpike was empty except for the occasional semi whispering past like a thought you weren't ready to have. A patch of fog slid across the asphalt. Then another. Jordan turned off the podcast she wasn't hearing anyway. The radio clicked, scanned, found nothing but a weather station murmuring about a temperature inversion and localized ground haze. She cracked her window. Cold air pushed in, heavy with cut hay and something sweeter, like fruit that's 2 days past ripe. The first sign appeared so gradually it felt like it had been there the whole time. Exit 41B, Lost Prairie, 1 mile. Jordan frowned. She knew this stretch. She knew every diner, every billboard for fireworks and fireworks attorneys. She did not know Lost Prairie. It was all fields out there, a fence line, a row of windbreak trees leaning the same way year after year. Half a mile later, another sign. White arrow. Services icons. Gas. Food. Lodging. You don't exist, she said to no one, half laughing at herself. She could have used the gas, though. Quarter tank. Enough. Probably. The next real exit was 12 miles east. She told herself she would pass it. She told herself she was tired, that brains invent things when they're low on glucose and lower on sleep. And then, the ramp appeared on the right shoulder, widening. Guardrail gleaming. That polite slope down into dark. Jordan signaled because that's who she is. She took the ramp. The turnpike fell away behind her with a long exhale. At the bottom, she met a stop sign that reflected too hard. The letters were too clean, like no bug had ever decided to die there. Ahead, a two-lane cut east-west. To the right, a gas station glowed white and silent. A small motel squatted beside it. Single story, doors painted that particular tan only motels believe is comforting. A diner with a chrome smile was set back from the road, open, flickering in red, as if someone was pinching the wire. Jordan turned toward the light. The gas station looked like a stage set. Pumps wrapped in plastic that wasn't torn, just loose. The credit card screen on pump 3 displayed a blinking cursor that never advanced. The clerk's area was stocked and empty, the sort of empty that says, "I'll be right back," and then never is. Jordan walked to the door and tried it. Locked. She cupped one hand to the glass and looked in. A handwritten sign leaned against the register, the paper browned at the edges. "Back in 10. Sure," she said softly. She checked her phone. 1 bar, then none. The clock ticked from 2:12 to 2:12. She could have left. Should have. The tank would make 12 miles. The turnpike was a left and a right away. Simple as heartbeat. But the diner's neon winked at her again, and she realized her hands were shaking. Food would fix that. Coffee would fix the rest. The diner door opened on the first push, little bell clearing its throat. Inside, everything wore a thin frosting of time, sugar shakers filmed over, a pie case holding 3 perfect slices that looked printed. The air smelled like warm toast and old pennies. A man stood behind the counter in a white shirt with a name tag that said LYLE in clean block letters. He wasn't young or old. He was the age of a thought you've had too many times. "Kitchen's still hot," he said, like they'd been talking. "Sit wherever." Jordan picked the end of the counter. It felt good to sit. The stool sighed. Lyle poured coffee without asking. The cup steamed like it was trying to say something. "Rough night?" he asked. "Long," she said. "I'm sorry. What town is this?" "I know the turnpike pretty well." "Gottly." Lyle smiled a little, like he'd been waiting for the question all night. "Lost Prairie," he said. "You're safe here." That last part didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like permission. A woman in a corner booth looked up then, hair tied in a scarf, hands around her mug like she was holding a sleeping bird. She had the expression of someone listening to a song only she could hear. Behind her, the motel sign blinked in the window's reflection, and in the blink, its letters rearranged themselves into nothing, just red worms on glass. "What's good?" Jordan asked, because asking normal questions makes reality behave. "It usually does." "Grilled cheese," Lyle said. "Tomato soup. Or pie. It's all warm." "Soup," she said. "And do you have quarters?" The motel sign said laundry. "And I need..." She trailed off. She didn't need laundry. She just wanted to ask for the coin. The impulse came the way you sometimes want to pat a dog you don't know. Lyle slid 2 quarters across the counter. They were colder than the coffee mug. "We trade square here," he said. "You can settle up before you go." Jordan picked up 1 quarter. On the obverse, Washington wore a nick across his jaw like a pale scar. She didn't recognize the state on the reverse. The outline looked like a mistake. "Where's everybody?" she asked. "Seems quiet." "Depends when you ask," Lyle said. "You coming off the pike?" "Yeah." Lyle nodded like that meant something. "Road's been hungry," he he said. Fog pulls people sideways. You found the right place to step out of it. The soup came the right red, steam curling, a skin forming and breaking like a memory. Jordan ate. The heat steadied her. Lyle didn't hover. The woman in the booth hummed without opening her mouth. At some point, Jordan realized the coffee didn't cool. It stayed at that first sip temperature no matter how long she let the conversation and the spoon trick the clock. She checked her phone again. 2:12. Again. 2:12. Can I ask you something weird? She said. Lyle tipped his head. How do I get back on the turnpike? The question sounded too heavy. She felt suddenly stupid for asking it. Like asking a lake how to be less wet. Same way you came, Lyle said. Left at the light, up the ramp. But don't look at the sign. Let it look at you. And when you merge, don't check your mirrors right away. The road doesn't like to be watched. Leaving. That's weird, he finished for her. Yeah, Jordan paid. The quarters clinked against the counter and sounded like they'd dropped too far. She stood. The bell at the door cleared its throat again as she left. Outside, the fog had thickened. Shapes moved in it, not bodies. Exactly. Suggestions. The motel's doors were all closed. In the office window, a TV blued the blinds with a show that had no sound and no cuts. She got in her car. The engine turned like it had been sleeping lighter than she had. At the intersection, the light was red. No cross traffic, no wind, just red, and the fog moving like breath on glass. Jordan waited. The red was not going to turn. When it felt like a dare, she looked down at her lap and counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. When she looked up, the light was green. The ramp rose like a dark throat. The turnpike flowed above, white lines pulsing, semis moving like planets that forgot you. She merged, eyes forward, hands soft on the wheel. For a second, only a second, she almost checked her mirror. That's the moment the urge is strongest, when the danger feels like it's already gone. She kept her eyes ahead. She breathed out. The coffee in her chest finally cooled. 10 miles later, she let herself glance to the right, where the shoulder meets the weeds. No ramp. No sign. A gap in the fence line that might have been anything. The fog thinned. The temperature lifted a degree. The radio found a song she used to love and hadn't heard in years. Her phone woke up and scolded her with notifications. She laughed then, out of nothing but relief. It came out like a hiccup and made her eyes water. At home, she slept like she'd been dropped. When she woke at noon, the quarters were on her kitchen counter where she didn't remember putting them. She picked one up. It wasn't cold anymore. It was room temperature, coin temperature, forgettable. But when she flipped it over, the state outline had decided what it was. Ohio. Of course. And yet there, in the outer ring of text, between United and States, a hairline crack that formed a tiny, narrow sliver. Like a ramp you only see if you stop trying to. Jordan went back over the next few weeks. In daylight, exit 41B was just nothing. Corn, a fence, the suggestion of a dip where rainwater collected if the wind was right. At night, she avoided that stretch, without deciding to. When coworkers asked why she took the long way home, she said construction, or deer, or boredom. You don't talk about a place like that unless you know the person hearing you won't try to go see it for themselves. People will tell you America is all mapped, that there are no blank spaces left, only smaller and smaller unknowns squeezed into the drainage ditches of the interstate. That's true, mostly. But some exits aren't for everyone. They're for the ones the road would like to keep, just for a minute until the fog decides it's bored of you. If you find yourself out there after midnight, if the green rectangle blooms ahead where there isn't supposed to be anything, if your dashboard clock decides this minute is worth repeating, here's how you pass through. Take the ramp like you meant to. Warm your hands around a coffee that refuses to cool. Pay for something simple with something small. When you go, don't look back too soon. Let the road do the leaving. And later, when you empty your pockets and a coin feels colder than it should, don't throw it out. Some places don't want your fear, they want your manners. And if you ever hear somebody at a truck stop ask where Lost Prairie is, just shake your head and say you haven't seen it in years. Then finish your coffee and go while the light is green.
Every night, something stopped right outside his door at 1:47 a.m. The old house on Hemlock Lane had always felt like a different world, a relic of a time long past, nestled deep within the suburbs of Salem, Massachusetts. It was a place where history wasn't just in the books, but echoed in the floorboards and whispered in the wind that rustled through the ancient oak trees in the yard. For Liam, moving into this house had been a dream. A quiet, sprawling place with a fireplace and a library that smelled of old paper and leather. A perfect escape from the relentless hustle of city life. The first few weeks were idyllic. He spent his days painting the walls, replacing old fixtures, and trying to coax the garden back to life. The nights were calm, filled with the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of crickets. That is, until the first night it happened. He was in his study, lost in a book, when a shiver ran down his spine. He glanced at the clock on his laptop. 1:46 a.m. A sudden, unexplained stillness fell over the house. The crickets outside went silent. The hum of the fridge faded into nothing. The air grew heavy, cold, and thick, with an unspoken presence. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, he heard it. A sound on the porch outside, a slow, deliberate movement on the worn wooden planks. Another one. Closer. And another. They were coming up the steps. 1, 2, 3. A steady, unhurried rhythm. He froze, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He told himself it was just the house settling, just the wind playing tricks. But the sounds were too distinct, too heavy to be anything but a person. The steps reached the top of the porch. A pause. He could almost feel the presence just outside his front door. He held his breath, listening with every fiber of his being. The sounds began to move again. They were walking along the porch now, parallel to the front of the house. He could hear them passing the living room window. He imagined a dark figure, cloaked in shadow, pacing back and forth just a few feet away. The sound of the steps was unnerving. They were not fast, not a hurried escape. They were a slow, purposeful patrol, a sentinel on a beat. Then, the sound stopped, right outside his study window, the very window he was looking at. He squeezed his eyes shut, a plea to a silent God that this was all a dream. When he opened them, the window was still dark, reflecting his own terrified face. And then, he heard the faintest sound, a soft, gentle scratching, as if a fingernail were being dragged along the window pane. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. He simply sat, rigid with fear, until the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a faint light into his room. He didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. Every night, it was the same. The silence at 1:46 a.m. The slow, deliberate sounds starting on the porch, the walk along the side of the house, the stop right outside his door, and the gentle, unnerving scratch. He began to anticipate it, his body tensing as the clock crept closer to the dreaded time. He started leaving the lights on, not just in his room, but throughout the entire house. He put a chair in front of the door, a flimsy, pathetic defense against something that felt more like a ghost than a person. He tried to reason it away. A prank? A local legend he hadn't heard about? He asked the neighbors. Old Mrs. Albright, who had lived on Hemlock Lane her entire life, just gave him a knowing, sad look. Some houses, they have memories, she'd said. And some memories, they never fade. The local police just laughed it off as a case of an overactive imagination. It's an old house, son. It's gonna make noises. But it wasn't just noise. He started to feel a presence, even when the sounds weren't there. A cold spot in the hallway, the faint scent of something like old earth and rain, the feeling of being watched from the dark corners of the rooms. He was losing his grip on reality. His friends from the city came to visit, and he was so on edge, he'd jump at every creak of the floorboards. They told him he needed a vacation, that he was stressed out. They didn't hear what he heard. They didn't feel the chill in the air when the clock neared 1:47 a.m. He became a prisoner in his own home. He'd spend his days trying to exhaust himself, hoping he would fall into a deep, dreamless sleep,